Culture clash. With all the changes in culture during the 1920s, it's no surprise that some of these cultures are going to clash against each other. And so this is really looking at all of those culture clashes of the 20s. One of the first ones we see is nativism. The thing is, nativism is not a new theme. It's been around, and you have to keep in mind it's going to just be renewed during this time period, especially with things like the Red Scare and people's fear of, Bolshevik communism coming to America. But we are going to see it gains even more following during the 1920s, and there is going to be legislation that follows with it. So it's going to be things like the Emergency Quota Act of 1921 reduced immigration by about 2/3, and you can kind of see that in this political cartoon here, and it established quotas for different nationalities. Now, this is going to become even more the case with the National Origins Act of 1924. Congress is going to use really a racist rationale to specifically restrict immigration quotas to 2% of the foreign-born population of each nationality as recorded in 1890. Now, if you rewind to 1890, that census was taken actually before a lot of the mass immigrations from like Southern and Eastern Europe. So it's specifically aimed at limiting people from these, so to speak, undesirable places. Other actions are going to target like Japanese residents specifically. It'd be things like prohibiting them from owning or leasing land. And in fact, the Supreme Court in 1922 would rule that non-white people could never become naturalized citizens. Now, this is talking about immigrants. So what it basically means is like groups like the Japanese, if they immigrated to the United States, they never could become a United States citizen. And their only hope was that their children who were born in America and thus would be American citizens by birth, at least would have rights. Now, there is one group I want to specifically mention that we don't see limited coming into the United States, and that is from the Philippines. You have to keep in mind the Philippines at this point was a part of the United States. It was a United States territory, and therefore it's not subject to the National Origins Act. And so immigration actually from the Philippines increased a whole lot during this time period. We also are going to see the Ku Klux Klan revived during the 1920s. Really, this new Klan was revived in about 1915. Very much they admitted only native-born white Protestants. When I say native-born, that's a lowercase n. It was just that they were born in America. They were a fraternal order, but they were also almost like giving them entertainment and assistance, and it was really like a community for its members, but very much it supported immigration restriction and prohibition, and very much were racist against African Americans. They're going to exploit any kind of racial and ethnic and religious prejudices to try to push forward their agenda. It's during this decade that you see the Ku Klux Klan marching with like flaming crosses. Very much they're anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish. Some would go as far as like to burn down churches or even kill a priest if they see them like challenging traditional Protestant culture. Now, most of the Ku Klux Klan was rooted in the declining countryside, but as you can see here with, Washington right behind it, we are going to see that it attracts urban residents. The Ku Klux Klan is going to venture into politics, and they are going to meet some success there. But eventually they will encounter some resistance, and generally they took their agenda a bit too far, and respect for the institution would oftentimes turn to outrage. Basically, they'd be stung by kind of a criminal element within their group and corruption of their leaders. So by about 1930, the Klan has nearly collapsed, though obviously there are people that still consider themselves part of the Klan all the way through to today. And then we have Prohibition. So this is the 18th Amendment, which is going to prohibit alcohol, but then you get the Volstead Act that's going to define exactly what are the forbidden liquors and established the Prohibition Bureau to enforce the law. Because it's one thing to have a law, but if you don't enforce it, there you go. So the government, despite setting up the Prohibition Bureau, is not going to really be able to enforce the 18th Amendment where public opinion didn't endorse it. The thing is, evasion of prohibition was actually really easy because they had to permit alcohol for like medicinal reasons, sacramental reasons, industrial purposes. And so that was like a huge loophole. And so a lot of people are going to manage just to like import alcohol from Canada, Cuba, or Mexico. The other issue is that as much as they set up the Prohibition Bureau, it was really limited in its resources. And so they oftentimes would just have to allow bootleggers to operate openly. And the huge profits from selling what was really a banned item is going to encourage organized crime. They would set up these like elaborate liquor distribution networks, and you'd get like gangsters using violence to enforce their contracts. They'd suppress competition as well and attack rivals. One of the most famous of this time period was Al Capone and his gangsters, and they actually killed hundreds in trying to maintain their alcohol network. The thing is, this kind of organized crime is also going to go on to corrupt like city officials, government officials, police forces. And with this huge boost in criminal activity, a lot of people who were considered dries or were for prohibition are going to actually start dropping their support because they were horrified by the boost this amendment basically gave organized crime. A lot of people are going to want to have it repealed or modified, and we are going to see that the 18th Amendment is going to be repealed in February of 1933 under the 21st Amendment. And this brings us to the last big group that we see cultural clashes with, Protestant fundamentalists. And if you think about it, this group really ties into a lot of the other groups because it can tie into nativism, being like anti-Catholic and everything like that. The Ku Klux Klan were generally Protestant fundamentalists, and Prohibition, to a sense, was a lot of times a Protestant viewpoint. So when we have Protestant fundamentalism emerging at the turn of the century, a lot of this was a reaction against religious modernism and just social changes where we had like the mass immigration of like Jewish people and Catholic people coming. And so this is when you start seeing a lot of formation of different fundamentalist groups. But one of their big issues is going to be Darwin's theory of evolution. The thing is that contradicted literal interpretations of biblical creation. And so Protestant fundamentalists would try to prevent the teaching of evolution in public schools in at least 20 different states. And actually the most prominent of the anti-evolution politicians of this time period is William Jennings Bryan. So we've definitely heard that name before, and if you can't remember it, I would definitely go back and rewatch some of the different lessons. So the thing is, William Jennings Bryan, on one hand, is a Protestant fundamentalist, but there's a bit more to him than like just that. He campaigned for a lot of like political, social, and economic reforms. He never endorsed the Ku Klux Klan, so he's not taking up that part of the issue and everything like that. He really wanted to help religious minorities, and actually William Jennings Bryan condemned any kind of anti-Catholicism or anti-Semitism. The thing that he took issue with the most was Darwinism, or the idea of survival of the fittest. William Jennings Bryan's issue with this was that it elevated the idea of force and brutality and ignored like spiritual values and democracy. If you're going to say survival of the fittest, there's an element there of why should I ever help out poor people? Why should I ever help out other groups because they weren't the strongest? And so he felt like the idea of Darwinism and social Darwinism discouraged altruism and reform. Now, all of this is going to come to a head in the Scopes trial. So John Scopes was a high school biology teacher in Dayton, Tennessee. He violated the law and was arrested, although actually most likely he probably never violated the actual law, and he worked with the group and agreed to say he had, basically so that they could take him to trial. This trial gains national attention, and there's a really good movie on it, and I just blanked on what it's called, but please feel free to look it up. Excellent movie, though they've changed the names of the people in it and everything. It is a fictional account in the movie. But it gains national attention, the trial, and what happens is Clarence Darrow was a famous Chicago lawyer and a prominent atheist, and he volunteered to defend John Scopes. Now, right away, the trial is going to be skewed away from defending Scopes, because the judge, for instance, is not going to allow any scientist to testify in support of evolution, because then that would be considered hearsay as they were not present for it. But the judge is going to allow Darrow to actually put William Jennings Bryan himself on the stand as an expert on the Bible. The thing is, this basically allows Darrow to ridicule Bryan and the idea of the literal truth of every single story in the Bible. And basically, William Jennings Bryan had to admit that, okay, some of the stories have to be construed symbolically. Now, that being said, as much as the fundamentalists suffered public ridicule with this trial, the jury still only took 8 minutes to convict Scopes. So he's still found guilty, he has to pay a fine, things like that. And like I said, the fundamentalists are ridiculed, but they're not destroyed by this. They're going to continue their campaigns, but really this movement falters by about 1929. So, how can you compare these clashes to cultural clashes today?